Welcome, everybody, to Soccer 101. My name is Taylor Rockwell, and this week, it's a good one. It's an exciting one. It's a salacious one. It's rivalries, specifically rivalries in the Premier League. We're looking at team versus team, manager versus manager, player versus player, even maybe teammate versus teammate. Graham, it can be a lot of different types of rivalry. How have you approached this episode with that in mind? Because even in the planning of this episode, I think we ran around a couple different ways of approaching the best rivalries of the Premier League era.
I've also got notes on podcast versus podcast. I've got TSS versus SoccerWise here. I've got a whole chronological timeline here of the beef between the two podcasts.
You say that in jest. I feel like Football Ramble versus Football Weekly was a bit of an active rivalry for some time.
I know, there's obviously an origin story with a certain athletic-linked podcast that spawns from the Guardian Football Weekly as well, but we won't get into that. I remember, podcast versus podcast rivalries are a real thing, dude, not so much with us in SoccerWise. But
that's true. I remember the story of Football Weekly winning Football Podcast of the Year at the Podcast Awards or whatever in London, and Barry Glendenning holding the award to the Football Ramble table and saying, "You come at the king, you best not miss," which is incredible.
That is good. Yeah, that sounds very like Barry Glendenning. But yeah, in terms of the framing of this episode, we're recording this in November 2025, just a few days before a Manchester City-Liverpool game this weekend. I expect that will be an interesting game. You might well be listening to this after a 0-0 board draw, but it seems like it'll be interesting, right? But we are now out of the Pep versus Klopp era of that game, and it just made me wonder what the significance of that particular rivalry is now. And it seems like we've got Arsenal rising, so it just, in my mind, I'm very conscious of how we're moving from one era to something else. And then when I think of particular eras of the Premier League, I kind of use rivalries for a framework. So those are the things that, for me anyway, define those periods of time better than anything else. And from that, you get defining matches and players and teams versus teams and managers versus managers, and they all kind of wrap into one, and there's overlap and everything. And that's why I think this episode can largely be defined as the defining rivalries of the Premier League era, and from that we can kind of take it in any which direction that we want, because to be honest, you can't really separate out the team versus team rivalries from the manager versus manager rivalries. They're all one of the same, and I imagine that's what we'll experience in this episode.
I want to spend some time with City Liverpool, obviously, and I think that's a great point to reference up front, Graham. But I think to understand why I find that one so captivating, I want to go back a little bit, because I do sort of think, with certain exceptions in recent history, the rivalries of the 90s and early 2000s felt much more like people did not like each other and actively were sort of trying to get one over on the other. Sir Alex Ferguson could be on this list 5 or 6 times in a top 5 list. I don't know how much that was ever the case with the Pep and City versus Klopp and Liverpool, but if we're looking at maybe some club versus club or manager versus manager rivalries in which there seem to be active bad blood and active animosity, where would you look first?
So I think there's only one place to look in terms of my number one personal managerial rivalry, and that is Ferguson versus Wenger, which was for a long time Arsenal versus Manchester United. I am willing to accept this might be a generational thing, because this was smack bang in the middle of my formative years as a football fan. But Ferguson versus Wenger, Manchester United versus Arsenal is, for me, the quintessential Premier League rivalry. And in terms of everything it encapsulates, you could argue that Mourinho and Wenger, maybe they hated each other more as individuals, but it didn't have as much around it, right? Where you also had Keane, Vieira, you had these defining matches, you had so much that it was enveloped with it, and it was all consuming to a point where, growing up, I was wary of, and I grew up in Scotland, didn't even grow up in England, but I was wary of how, as a kid, you had to pick a side. So one of my best pals, he's a St Mirren fan, never been an Arsenal fan, but growing up, he had Thierry Henry shirts, and he was always Arsenal on that side of things. And I had a couple of Manchester United shirts, mainly because of the Scottish connection, I guess. Darren Fletcher would play for them, Ferguson obviously being Scottish. So I sort of leaned that way. And it was such a powerful thing at the time, that rivalry. I actually think it was a big factor in the Premier League growing in the way that it did at that time. You think of late 90s into the early 2000s, that's when the Premier League starts to stretch its legs and become sort of the commercial giant that it is today. And I think a lot of that was down to just the interest at the top of the table. This rivalry that spanned from when does Wenger arrive? 96 and wins the title in 98, I think. It's around about that time anyway. I think 97 maybe he was his first season.
I would love to nod agreeably, but I'm not even sure I know enough to do that. So
I think it was 97 he arrived, and then he won it in 98, and then Manchester United the treble seasons the following season. But from 97...
He arrived in 1996. Graham Ruthven, how could you not know that?
That was my first suggestion. I just corrected myself, which actually turned out to be wrong. Anyway, from that period until when 2000 and the mid 2000s, when Mourinho turns up, that is just the prism through all of the Premier League, at least the top level, is kind of viewed through. So it was huge.
If you're simplifying that rivalry down, I struggle with exactly how to it's blank versus blank. You've gone through it in terms of the individuals, both managerial and players, and the clubs themselves. But in terms is there a philosophical clash? Because I think Wenger initially he has quotes like "They are scrappers who rely on belligerents. We are artists." And then I feel like Mourinho comes into the scene and he's like, "Never mind, they're the belligerents. Manchester United is their own thing." But it did feel like it was too Manchester United, historically very successful, and then Arsenal have had successes, don't get me wrong, in their history, but the early 2000s Arsenal is its own animal. It feels like it's just two very successful teams that maybe achieved that success in slightly different ways. But ultimately it felt like managers who were just trying to beat the other one and out-tactic and out-tinker the other one versus we are beautiful possession, we are high-pressing intensity, or we are sit deep and defend sort of styles.
Yeah, I mean, I think the driving force of this rivalry is the dynamic between the two managers, between Ferguson and Wenger. Two obviously outstanding coaches and leaders, but sort of completely, or at least from completely different ends of the spectrum. So Fergie is this salt of the earth, working class, former shipbuilder who is, fearsome and takes no nonsense and has built this dynasty by the time Wenger arrives. And then Wenger is this sort of outsider who comes in from Japan, which already marks him out as something different. And he has this nickname of Le Professor, doesn't he? And he's seen as a kind of deeper thinker, and he has all these new ideas and methods.
Yeah, it's eat a vegetable, and everyone was like, "How dare you!"
He's a revolutionary, this guy.
Crazy foreigner. He says, "Don't drink 9 pints of beer a night and eat a vegetable." I don't know what we're doing here.
But the thing is, obviously we're joking about this and looking back at it is kind of silly. But Arsenal now in 2025, even if they've moved on past the Wenger era, still have this reputation for being a modern, forward-thinking club. They never lost that post-Wenger, even as they had some difficult times. See, before Wenger, it's the days of George Graham and Tony Adams and 1-0 to the Arsenal, and their players would go to the pub after games, and so Arsenal, their reputation as a club was entirely different, and Wenger comes in and completely, fundamentally changes that from the ground up. And so he was the challenger, and so not only were Arsenal a winning machine for a period, they were attractive and entertaining. And Manchester United, they signed great players, but they would often go to other Premier League teams to get those players. They'd sign Andy Cole or laterally it would be Van Persie or whatever. Manchester United were always good at that. Whereas Arsenal were a little bit more imaginative. They weren't signing nobodies, but they went and got Thierry Henry and turned him into centre forward, or they went and got Dennis Bergkamp from Inter Milan, I think he was at. So that in itself was a bit of a clash that now we take that as normal. What Arsenal were doing in the late 90s is now normal in the Premier League. But back then it was a little bit different.
I do think because things get so publicly acrimonious between Wenger and Mourinho, that I think the Wenger and Ferguson one fades a little bit in its intensity. And I think some of that is also because there is a lot of similarity there, because I think I'm correct in saying with Tony Adams, Wenger kind of has to go to war with that philosophy and has to boot out players that are very popular and very successful at Arsenal because they just clash on a philosophical level, clash in terms of how they approach training and fitness and the like. And Ferguson, I think there are plenty of stories of him, the Lee Sharp showing up at his party in a tuxedo from an event to be like, "We're not doing this, Giggs, get out of here, you're 12. You don't need to be at a party like this." I think both of them had a begrudging respect for the authority that the other one conveyed and the sincerity with which they approached football. Ferguson beating Wenger 8-2 with that squad of players that he did maybe cements him as the winner in this one. There's no bias there for me at all as a Manchester United supporter. But then I think it is also fueled by the Vieira Keane tunnel incident that you referenced already, and Handshake Gate, where There's just a lot of bad blood. There's a lot of dislike between players in those teams. There's dislike between the coaches and even the supporters. And so I think that is a very important historic rivalry in the Premier League.
Yeah, and with what you're saying there, Taylor, about Ferguson and Wenger being two sides of the same coin, there's that bit in Ferguson's autobiography. He was going to retire in 2002, and so Manchester United, who was the chairman at the time? Martin Edwards, I think that was the Manchester United chairman at the time, speaks to Ferguson and says, who would you like to replace you? He says Arsene Wenger. And Martin Edwards kind of laughs that out. No, we can't get Arsene Wenger. And they eventually settle on Sven-Göran Eriksson, who was lined up as the guy to replace Ferguson in 2002. That would have been interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was definitely that underlying, so even in the heat of battle where the two, to the media, they didn't like each other much. Asked who you want to replace you, Arsene Wenger was his answer. That's the guy that you saw as most similar to him. And I think that two sides of the same coin thing is reflected in the Keane-Vieira rivalry better than anything else, because clearly they did not like each other much on the field and off the field as well, in the Highbury Tunnel, where there's the famous clash where
I'll see you out there.
Yeah, Keane is barking to Vieira, shut your effing mouth, and you know, you'll see him out there and stop picking on wee Gary Neville. But Keane and Vieira were very similar as players. And I think some people now, in retrospect, because Keane has leaned into this reputation as like a pundit as much as anything, of like as a hard man, I think people forget how good he was as an all-round central midfielder. He was outstanding, Roy Keane, and so was Patrick Vieira, and they really could have played in the same team together. I think they were all round. They had the all-round game that you could put them in a midfield together, and it would have worked.
No fun.
That would have been interesting.
Yeah, no smiles. No.
Yeah. But they were. I think the fact that they do punditry together now, although Vieira's been out of punditry for a little while he's been coaching, but they used to do ITV punditry together during major tournaments, and they would say things, and I'm like, man, you two are so similar, and that's, I guess, why they kind of clashed.
Didn't they do like a program called Rivals, where it's the two of them talking about that clash and that rivalry and everything?
It's good.
Yeah, so I think like when the dust settles, I guess you can get good breakdowns of the tension that was present. Which manager do you feel like had the most rivalries in the Premier League? Because it feels like it does come down to Wenger or Ferguson. But Wenger had like his own little list there, because it is Allardyce, who he from I think the Bolton era, who he criticizes for being Route One and overly physical and not an artist, says the same thing of Ferguson, certainly says the same thing of Mourinho. But Ferguson, for his part, has Wenger, like we already talked about. There's Rafa Benitez in there. There's Kevin Keegan, certainly. There's probably a few other ones that I'm forgetting. It does feel like in the end it's probably Ferguson who had the larger volume.
Yeah, as I was kind of compiling my list here, I realised how many were linked to Ferguson. Like Ferguson versus Mourinho, Ferguson versus like when Man City were rising, the kind of like Roberto Mancini era, maybe even the Mark Hughes era. Yeah, Ferguson loved this stuff. He lived for these rivalries.
I know, like, sometimes the I'm on Setanta Sports puppet Mourinho blends into, like, real-life Mourinho in my head. But it does, that puppet show, for people who don't remember it or never saw it, there was, like, briefly on Setanta Sports, which used to have soccer coverage, used to be a network. There was, like, a puppet show based around Jose Mourinho, the puppet, Sven-Göran Eriksson, I think Rooney was in there, there's a few other ones. And the Mourinho puppet did a great job of like showing the pettiness of Mourinho. And to your point, I think the puppet Mourinho always called him Mr. Alex deliberately instead of Sir Alex. And that felt like the exact type of thing Jose would do. I think that's where voyeur comes from, although that might actually be a Jose Mourinho
that's
slight, towards Wenger for like being so obsessed with what Chelsea were doing. He's always looking at our windows. He's a voyeur. Like there was just, I think Jose didn't shy away from like being truly petty and name calling. But not just because he was petty, because it made other managers lose their minds and get really angry. And when they're angry and overreacting, you're kind of winning the mind games. It's the Sir Alex Ferguson playbook. Jose Mourinho executed it to perfection.
Yeah, I think with Ferguson, Mourinho always respected Ferguson. So even in the heat of battle, and it was a two-way thing. Ferguson in retirement seems to love Jose Mourinho and like meets with him. You see pictures of them like going for coffee or going for a meal or whatever. So there's definitely a relationship there. I don't think there was ever a relationship between Mourinho and Wenger. I think you could put the two of them in a room today and it would be a problem. So that's where the pettiness and the nastiness was I think was most acute with all of Mourinho's and Wenger's rivalries. I mean, that full quote, Taylor, that you mentioned, the voyeur one, this is it. Wenger has a real problem with us, and I think he's what you call in England a voyeur. He is someone who likes to watch other people. There are some guys who, when they're at home, have a big telescope to see what happens in other families. Wenger must be one of them. It is a sickness. He speaks about Chelsea. I mean, yeah, there's not a lot of respect. There's a couple others here that I've noted down.
I love that he said in English you have this word, clearly a French word, but still kind of attacking the French manager. It does double duty for Mourinho.
It's very good. And another quote, this is from Wenger in response. He is out of order, disconnected with reality and disrespectful. When you give success to stupid people, it makes them more stupid sometimes and not more intelligent. And then from Mourinho in response, and this is quite famous as well, he is a specialist in failure. I am not. So if one supposes he's right. And I'm afraid of failure, it's because I don't fail many times. So maybe he's right. I am not used to failing, but the reality is he is a specialist because 8 years without a piece of silverware, that's failure no matter which way you look at it. I mean, yeah, it's brutal.
Like, is he the king of just direct attacks in that way, or direct criticism? Because like, there is definitely other moments like with Sir Alex Ferguson where he is, I think, getting a rise out of other coaches, and he has, like with the Rafa Benitez, like these are facts monologue, like that's in response to Ferguson making a sort of veiled, like, shot at Liverpool, but it's a comment about Liverpool, but it's not about Rafa Benitez. It's not a personal attack. It feels like Mourinho did not shy away from like publicly saying, this guy's a jerk, I don't like him.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the best mind games are, or the most effective ones are the ones that are quite tactile and a little bit veiled, and you have to kind of decipher them. Yeah, there wasn't much of that between Mourinho and Chelsea. And actually, like, I think it was, with a lot of these rivalries, you can say, well, it was a managerial rivalry, but, you know, it was the two teams. I think with Liverpool and City, that's the best example of that, where there was never really any animosity between Klopp and Guardiola. Maybe there was some needle in a couple matches, but it never really seemed to linger long. With that rivalry, it was just a case of we were seeing the two best teams in probably the world and the two best managers in the world at that time. With Arsenal and Chelsea, in particular Mourinho and Wenger, just felt purely personal. Like, I can't really think of, like, those two teams at that time. They weren't, you know, Wenger's golden period or Arsenal's golden period had kind of fizzled out by the time by the time Mourinho comes along to Chelsea in 2005. And so it wasn't really like Arsenal were going for the title with Mourinho's Chelsea. It was just purely because those two guys didn't like each other.
I should say Ferguson took some shots himself, specifically at Wenger, but we've kind of already talked a little bit about that rivalry. But I loved after Wenger made comments about United's fixture list. He called him a novice, said he should keep his opinions to Japanese football. When there were follow-up questions about it, I think his line was, he's been talking about Manchester United. He's got a lot to say for a man who's been in English football for 5 minutes. But Ferguson, for the most part, I feel like would sort of ratchet up the mind games, ratchet up the pressure, and then when the other coach responded, he was the equivalent of the person who like yells at you, Graham, and then when you raise your voice back, then they're very quietly like, "Well, why are you yelling? Like, we don't need to raise voices." He would wind up like Dalglish, Rafa Benitez, another one, and then when they would have their responses, he would then be like, "Oh man, they're losing it. That guy's crazy," and I think kind of pile on the pressure of making that person seem like they were losing their mind or kind of letting the situation get the better of them. And then that becomes the narrative, and I think that happened with Benitez for sure, Kenny Dalglish a little bit, but Kevin Keegan especially.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin Keegan one is infamous, right? The I'll love it if we beat them rant, which coincided with Newcastle United collapsing from a point of being 12 points clear in the title race. It's the biggest advantage ever conceded by a team in a Premier League title race. And yeah, you're right, Taylor. Ferguson, he'd ramped up the mind games. He continually questioned if Keegan and Newcastle had the bottle to go the distance. He questioned their tactics and signings, and the most laughable thing was he questioned the money that they were spending, because Newcastle had a bit of money behind them at that time. They had Freddie Shepherd, who was like a local businessman, and so Newcastle around that time, I think this was after that season, but around that time, they go out and break the transfer record to sign Alan Shearer, and so Newcastle were spending a bit of money. Of course, Manchester United had been doing that for like 6 years previously, and the rest by that point. But nonetheless, Ferguson talked about the money that they had spent. until Kevin Keegan went pop in a TV interview and lost his mind in a rant.
I
that
would
really
love
showed
it.
That,
Yeah.
He was unravelling, and Manchester United ended up catching Newcastle, and Newcastle still haven't won a Premier League title, and it's still talked about to this day.
And I think when Ferguson hears about that rant and is asked about it, he like kind of just quietly responds like, he's obviously feeling the pressure. I think he's lost his composure. Like it's just like, why do you think that happened, Sir Alex?
Yeah.
How do you think that came to be? I do not want this to just become a Manchester United anecdotes podcast, but I do think there's two more Manchester United centric things to be discussed. One is a player versus player one that I think is a really interesting representation of what rivalries can be generally, but also of Manchester United of that era. And it's Andy Cole versus Teddy Sheringham, where you can have so much competitiveness and like desire to win within a team, as was present with that version of Manchester United under Ferguson, that those two players seem to actively loathe each other. And yet still won the treble together and still scored some goals together. But there's I believe I'm correct in saying it for Cole, it traces back to his first appearance for England. He's a substitute. He subs on for Sheringham. Sheringham is mad that he's being subbed off and basically just like walks off, I think, 20 yards from midfield, doesn't shake Cole's hand. Cole kind of feels like this was my moment. I built it up in my head. I'd imagined my first England debut, and here's this guy coming off, and then he just doesn't even do anything for me. He kind of makes it about himself and makes it about him sulking, and I think Cole carried a grudge from that. Then their teammates, they still don't really get along, and they still don't really communicate very much. I'm just gonna steal this from I think Cole's book, but basically, it's 1-1 against Bolton. They conceded early. Cole scores the equalizer. It's halftime. They're walking back to the locker room, and Sheringham turns around to Cole. I just love every part of this story. Sheringham turns around to Cole and says, "That goal was your fault." And Cole sort of loses his mind. He's like, "I've been playing well. I scored a goal. Who are you to talk to me like this? You never say anything to me, and now you're blaming me for a goal." He chases after Sheringham. They go into the locker room. They're at each other's throats. This is my favorite part from Cole. Do you know the story, Graham? Do you know where I'm going
Vaguely,
with this?
I've heard this, but remind me how it finishes.
I'm screaming all sorts and trying to throw punches, but everyone's on me, pulling us apart. This is, again, Cole. The next thing I know, Roy Keane has me up against the wall, and he's shouting in my face. I'll go ahead and curse, and then we can edit it. What the f*** are you doing, Coley? Sort yourself out. We're a team. I'm not hearing him, but I calm down, and suddenly Roy is going for Teddy, ripping into him, and it's our turn to try to pull them apart. What's all that about, Skip? I ask a clearly incensed Keane. To which Keane responded, "You wanting to fight him reminded me of what an he was to me at Nottingham Forest." And so I love that Keane very quickly switched from "I'm going to be the peacemaker" to "No, actually he is a jerk." It does feel like Sheringham was maybe the party that brought about some tension in there. But that's how tense a locker room can be for a team that goes on to win the treble. Like, it shows you these guys aren't always getting like along together and singing Kumbaya and living in harmony. It's about winning. It's about competitiveness. At least I think that's what it was for that Manchester United team.
Yeah, I was going to say it wasn't just Andy Cole that Teddy Sheringham railed up. Roy Keane wasn't much of a fan of him either. And like we can make jokes about Roy Keane, that kind of being his character. Roy Keane, to this day, if you talk about any of his former teammates, will staunchly defend them. Like, he still feels that captain role. The exception being Teddy Sheringham, when he's been brought up on the Overlap podcast when he's been on there.
What has he said?
Oh, I can't remember off the top of my head, but he just is like, we'll maybe move on from talking about Teddy Sheringham. He just says things that you can tell he's still not a fan.
The final anecdote on that one, when they signed Dwight York in '98, apparently it gets so bad that he has to like pass messages. Like, it's the child equivalent of Sheringham would be like, "Hey, like, ask Andy if he's doing this today," and then Dwight York would have to turn and be like, "Andy, are you doing that today?" And then would have to kind of turn back and communicate. Not the most functional of locker rooms, but I guess functional on the pitch.
Kind of wild that they won so much. Well,
right?
That was... Although Sheringham wasn't there for long, right? He was only there a couple of seasons and then kind of left again, so maybe that was why. In terms of like personal rivalries, Taylor, and this maybe doesn't quite fit the definition of what we're talking about here, but Rio Ferdinand on his podcast recently had Steven Gerrard on, and they were talking about the differences between... the current England team and why they've had a level of success that the golden generation, or the so-called golden generation, didn't have. And Steven Gerrard was very blunt and basically said, well, we didn't really like each other. Like, obviously now, like, they all seem to get along. You've got Carragher and Neville doing stuff for Sky Sports, and you've got Ferdinand and Steven Gerrard doing podcasts together. But he was making the point that when they came together for England, those rivalries between those groups of players and those teams was so fierce that they just couldn't get on the same page and operate for England together. So, yeah, I think that's maybe something to mention. That your Terrys, your Ferdinands, your Rooneys, Gerrard, Lampard, all those guys, there was definitely a tension between them that they just couldn't square that circle when they came together for the national team.
People often not often, but I've gotten criticism of the way I talk about USMNT and USMNT camps and how players describe it as being this very convivial family atmosphere that is not very common in a lot of other national teams. And I think people think it's just it's a national team. No, everybody approaches it that way. But I think to your point, Graham, a lot of those England teams that I think some of the Spain teams as well, it's pretty abundantly clear that those players are I'm a Manchester United player first, and then an England player. I'm a Liverpool player and then an England player. I think for the U.S., it's always been I'm a U.S. player first and then the club I play for. So you don't have those divisions. You don't have that rivalry. But when you do, I guess sometimes it can spur you on to greatness, as it did with a few of those Spain teams. But it can also kind of rip you apart because you're coming in not talking, having animosity towards each other, having even just unfounded beliefs about the other one. It's going to make it hard to cheer for the other one when they score or a kind of bond in training. Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, and just mentioning, while we're talking about Steven Gerrard, I think he has a good off point into another defining rivalry of the Premier League era, which is Chelsea versus Liverpool of the mid-2000s. This might be cheating a little bit because I think of the defining games, or two games of that rivalry being in the Champions League. That's the infamous ghost goal game with Luis Garcia. Was it over the line? I guess we'll never know. But I think people forget just how fierce it was between Chelsea and Liverpool for a long time. I in research in this episode, I found out that between October 2004 and 2009, they played each other 24 times, which is probably a big reason why they ended up at each other's throat. They played each other in cup finals and the Champions League. Obviously, they had their Premier League matches. And Mourinho, when you add Mourinho into that equation, it was just a grenade into the whole rivalry. He shushed the Liverpool fans in a Carling Cup final that Chelsea won in 2004. As I mentioned, you then have the ghost goal game. Mourinho responded with this quote, "The best team lost and didn't deserve to lose. They scored only one. Only one team played the game. The other team just defended for the whole match." So Mourinho was pretty sour about that one. And obviously that's the game that sends Liverpool to Istanbul for the final. And we all know what happened there. And there's an insecurity there that grows for Mourinho. And it's not often that you see him insecure. And it's particularly at that time, he always felt like he had the upper hand. The fact that Liverpool beat his team and then went on to win the Champions League, and he never won the Champions League with Chelsea. It was the one thing that was missing for him. There was a definite insecurity there for Mourinho. And Benitez, he wasn't a saint either. He enjoyed winding up Mourinho as well. This is a quote from Benitez at the time. "To me, Arsenal play much better football. They win matches and are exciting to watch. Barcelona and Milan too. They create excitement. So how can you say that Chelsea are the best team in the world? They are nowhere near." And then you had the Steven Gerrard situation, where Mourinho openly quoted him for years. And then one summer, Gerrard decides to hand in the transfer request and looked like he was going to force through a move, only for him to do a U-turn and stay at Liverpool. So that just added more to the lore of that rivalry that I think still kind of bubbles under the surface to this day. I even think of the infamous Gerrard slip game where they lose the title. That's against Chelsea, and you've got Mourinho. Even though Chelsea weren't in that title race, he's still at the Chelsea support, getting them to give him the reception, and it just feels like that rivalry is still bubbling under the surface somewhat.
How does Fernando Torres factor into that rivalry and those relationships in your mind?
So that comes after Mourinho, right? So I can't think who the Chelsea manager would have been at that time. I think it doesn't factor in much because Liverpool feel like they got the better deal out of that. I think it might have become a factor if Torres had gone to Chelsea and continued to be like a world-class striker. I think just because he was such a non-factor, it maybe didn't. Chelsea were quite happy to ignore that ever happened, and Liverpool were quite happy to count their cash.
Heard. What I mean, sorry, I was non-specific, is more so do you think that rivalry and the sort of frustration that maybe Chelsea felt about being knocked out and just the overall kind of building of tension, do you feel like that factors into the acquisition of Torres? Or was that just Abramovich wanted the player he wanted. Carlo Ancelotti, who was the manager of Chelsea at the time, said, "I'm not sure I want that," but it happened anyway.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, Abramovich would have felt that rivalry as well, and obviously had the money and resources to go and take Liverpool's shiny striker, or appeared to be shiny striker. It was more like a chocolate coin wrapped in tinfoil than an actual gold coin that they ended up getting in Fernando Torres. But at the time, that looked like they'd taken their best player.
It does also feel to me like a good representation of how you sort of need there to be an iconic manager, or at the very least a headline grabbing manager in charge of your club if you want those rivalries to kind of persist and develop. Because I think of Chelsea at that time, and maybe I'm misremembering, but I feel like you have the weird so Jose leaves, it's Avram Grant, Scolari is in there. I think Hiddink takes over at one point. Then there's Ancelotti, there's Villas Boas, but then you get into the Di Matteo of it all. Benitez is there briefly. It just felt like Chelsea went through this run of names, don't get me wrong, but none of them there long enough, and none of them had the kind of staying power and resonance and sound bites to kind of elevate that rivalry. And so I feel like it is an of its time rivalry, Chelsea. Yeah,
I think you need that that personality to build a narrative. I don't want to sound like a proper football man here, but that is kind of how I think of rivalries. There has to be a personal edge to it. Otherwise, it's just like two teams on a field playing each other, and that's kind of why the Liverpool-Man City rivalry, as good as it was, the quality. I remember there was a couple games where I was like, "Wow, the Premier League has never been better than this. These are the two best teams in the world, the two best managers in the world." But without that needle, and maybe it's because I was brought up on the Ferguson-Wenger rivalries, and then we went straight into Mourinho versus Wenger, and then you had Ferguson versus Mourinho. You had a run of really great rivalries back to back. It just always felt like it was missing something, missing a dimension. I did want a game where it just exploded and you just had a full-on brawl. Maybe that makes me sound like a Luddite, but hey, it's how I felt about that rivalry.
I don't think it does, and I think that is kind of common across all sports. I think it's a criticism of the NBA, the modern NBA specifically, is all these guys like each other too much and they all want to be teammates at some point, so they're never going to be so aggressive against each other. I think that's waned a little bit. I feel like there's some pretty public trash talking these days, but I do think you need to see what it means to the coaches. You need Mourinho sprinting down the sideline to see this guy cares more than anything. When you have Simeone running past the other manager to jump into the scrum of Atleti players celebrating in front of Real Madrid supporters, you get that vibe, you get that intensity, you get that feeling. And with Pochettino and with Klopp and Guardiola, it's they both wanted to beat the other one. You know that they raised their game and kind of they made each other better in that rivalry. But I don't feel like you had very obvious moments of these two guys are desperate to win. All of the players are desperate to beat each other. It just felt like two very good teams that are going to be interesting tactically, and then they're going to make adjustments, and who's going to win based on talent and performance. All very fair ways to look at the game, but it does miss a little bit of that. They do not like each other. They are pulling no punches to try to get the result here. And I think because of that, it's a really interesting rivalry because it is entirely about one team trying to arrest the dominance of the other and find a way to gain ground and ultimately win a league title and win a Champions League in Liverpool. But I think along the way, you don't have that obvious animosity, the sound bites where they're talking trash. Maybe there was a handshake gate in there. I can't remember. Maybe there were a few comments here and there, but for the most part, it felt like a very gentlemanly, we're all professionals here, we don't need to get into that sort of thing relationship.
Yeah, the other thing that was strange about that rivalry was I'm not totally sure what the sort of defining moments and matches were of it. So if I think of Manchester United, Arsenal, Ferguson, Wenger, which I've said is for me is the number one, I think of the Giggs goal in the FA Cup semi-final. I think of the Sylvain Wiltord winner at Old Trafford to win the title for Arsenal in the Invincible season? It was around that time. I think of the 8-2 game. I think of Arsenal beating Man United 6-1. What about that one? Do you recall that one?
That didn't happen.
Whereas with City and Liverpool, I mean, there's two games that do stand out in the memory. The 4-3 game that Liverpool won in the 17-18 season, which felt like Liverpool making a big step forward. I think was that the season they'd signed Van Dijk, and that was kind of, that elevated them to like, oh, they can really take on Man City now. And then the other one that really stands out is you have the Champions League quarter-final, which Liverpool won 5-1 on aggregate. I think that's 2018. That's the one where the City bus was smashed up on the way into Anfield. That was probably the biggest flashpoint in the whole rivalry, and it didn't even happen on the pitch. That was something that happened outside the stadium, and obviously I wouldn't condone that sort of thing from happening. But yeah, I just don't really know. A lot of the time it felt like shadow boxing. Yeah. Like even the title races between City and Liverpool, they set all kinds of points records. The most ridiculous one being Liverpool getting 97 points in the 18-19 season and still not winning the title because Man City got 98. 21-22 season was also like that. Liverpool got 92 points, once again finished second just because Man City were an absolute machine. But I don't really, unless I'm forgetting some games, like I don't really think of like pivotal matches in those title races that swung it one way or the other. It just felt like there was the rivalry between them happened outside of the head-to-head matches between the two teams, if that makes any sense.
It does. Is some of this, I'm asking you, because again, Manchester United supporter, I know how this can just sound like bias, but is some of that the recency of Manchester City's successes in that they're not a team that has historically won a bunch of silverware, been at the elite top level for so long that you have those rivalries naturally develop? It feels like on some level it's a team that had a ton of money put into them and they spent it well and they signed the right people and signed the right manager. But like we've talked about this before, it feels like they kind of exist with a policy of don't like muddy the waters, don't create that sort of PR headache. Obviously, they have some charges hanging over them, so they have their own PR headaches. But I just mean it feels like there isn't that sort of underlying either chaos or personality that elevates Manchester City into that conversation. Instead, they're just like a very wealthy team that spends well and wins a lot. And that has a narrative, don't get me wrong, but it's sort of like if the narrative of the movie is like the protagonist is charming and suave and wins every single time and never actually has to deal with adversity, I'm not sure how compelling that narrative is going to be.
Yeah, in terms of players on the pitch, for a long time, Man City just didn't have the personalities that lent itself to fierce rivalries. The personality at Man City for a long time, and still to this day, is Pep. And so when your opposite number, as Klopp was for a long time, has great respect for you and will say so in public, you're kind of like, where does the rivalry come from in this situation? What I've got great hope for Man City in terms of rivalries in the Premier League is Erling Haaland, and we're seeing one building with Arsenal, between Man City and Arsenal. We certainly saw it in the last couple of seasons. And the reason that has happened is because Erling Haaland is one of those personalities that Manchester City have not had really in the Pep Guardiola era. You have obviously him. And what's the root of it? He tells Man City to stay humble, right, after a game last season.
Because I think it's when I think it was the season before, maybe, whenever like Arsenal started to think that they were going to be like legitimate title contenders ahead of Manchester City, and then Manchester City beat them pretty resoundingly. I think Haaland has a comment about like stay humble, like, you know your place basically. So then when Arsenal beat City at home, they play Be Humble by Kendrick Lamar, and it's very much a talking point of like, maybe now it's your turn, guy who just lost a game. And you're right, Graham, that does feel like one where Haaland has the justifiable arrogance to like make those comments and come out and say some things that is going to make him unpopular, but he is also going to back it up with performances, generally speaking. And so you get the kind of ideal scenario there of the guy who can play well and will punish you and can back it up, but also at times is going to say a thing that is maybe too far or is going to rile up the fan base pretty successfully.
Yeah, and on the Arsenal side of things, they've got guys like Gabriel, who is very much willing to wade into that sort of thing. And then Lewis Skelly did the Haaland celebration on when he scored. Yeah. So there's definitely something there, and that's where right now, talking in 2025, that's where the next rivalry could be, because you've got the master versus apprentice thing as well with Arteta and Guardiola. You've got the kind of Anakin Skywalker element of things there. The problem is, as we're recording this, and look, this might change quickly, but as we're recording this in the 25-26 season, doesn't feel like Man City are that close to Arsenal. So you need the teams to be somewhat close to each other so it feels like there's something at stake. And if we get to a point where Arsenal and City are in that same space together, that's where I think things could kind of explode between the two of them.
Strange counterpoint to that, because I agree with you generally, but it's why I keep, and I said before, like, I don't want this to just be a Manchester United podcast. This was the second thing I wanted to bring up from a Manchester United perspective is Man United Liverpool. And that is, like, on paper, the biggest rivalry in the Premier League and in English football, and feels like one where there is a ton of animosity between the cities, in the history of the two cities, in the history of the two clubs, and in the individuals represented by both. At the same time, it's a weird one because in the Premier League era, it's not like they've been consistently the two best teams at any given point. I believe I'm correct in saying in the last 25 years, there is one season in which they finish 1 and 2. That is the only time both of them are like at the top of the table. And I think it's in like 2002, maybe? Like it's very early on. And so it's a strange one where they are such massively successful clubs, have had such a long history of success. But the 90s are largely dominated by Manchester United, Premier League founded in 92. And then into the early 2000s, you have Liverpool winning in the Champions League, but not really competing in the Premier League as much. And then when Liverpool starts to do that is when Ferguson has retired and Manchester United is in free fall. And so we haven't seen a really at their peak Manchester United versus at their peak Liverpool. I don't know when we've seen that in the Premier League. There have been moments where it felt like we might be building towards that with some of the Benitez teams and Fernando Torres ripping Vidic to shreds. But even there, it's still like Manchester United regularly beating Liverpool twice while losing to Chelsea twice.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the Benitez era because the counterpoint to your counterpoint, which I broadly accept, is the one kind of managerial. If you were talking about Liverpool and Manchester United in the Premier League era, what's the one managerial rivalry that's happened in that time? It's been Benitez versus Ferguson, and that comes, the facts rant, comes at a time when Liverpool are top of the Premier League for 3 or 4 months for the first half of the season, and then Manchester United reel them in. So yeah, I just think you get the most needle when there is something at stake between the two teams. I mean, if we're going through the ones that we've talked about so far, the only one that's kind of an exception is the Mourinho versus Wenger rivalry, where it just comes from how much they hate each other. Arsenal and Chelsea were kind of in the same space at that time, but also not really. Arsenal didn't win a whole lot at that time. Otherwise, it's teams that are going toe-to-toe for the biggest prizes. That's the thing that's going to light the fuse better than anything else.
Yeah. And I think we've largely avoided derbies in this conversation as well, and I think that's kind of because that goes without saying. Sunderland and Newcastle don't particularly care for each other. Liverpool and Everton don't really like each other. Arsenal and Tottenham the same. Do we need to spend time on any derby rivalry in particular, Graham, or do you feel like maybe that's its own episode?
I think that might be its own episode. I mean, the Manchester derby dynamic around the time Ferguson is winding down as Manchester United manager is really interesting, where clearly for the first time he feels like, he'd been challenged throughout his managerial career, but clearly he felt like there was something generational happening, and he was right about that.
Did he get schwacked, 6-2 by City at one point in there? Yeah.
That's the Balotelli game, right? The Why Always Me game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and you could sense that there was a power shift happening, and the fact that it was happening in the same city in Manchester just made it even more interesting. But yeah, I think this episode was more about kind of the personal rivalries between managers and players and teams that kind of define the Premier League era. Maybe we should do another episode about sort of derbies that have defined the Premier League.
Are there any other rivalries on your list, Graham? Because there are obviously ones in the early 90s that could be discussed. There's obviously more minor ones between clubs and managers and the like, but I think we've kind of covered a lot of the broad strokes, the biggest rivalries.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, who else? I was trying to think of other successful teams like Pochettino's Spurs. The thing about them, when they were at their best, the other teams were around them were kind of in a bit of a lull. That's the Leicester City season when Spurs maybe will look at that as a missed opportunity. So I can't really think of that leading to any sort of defining rivalries.
I think
I think we've covered everything.
A lot of the listicles I saw, I was sort of like, you guys didn't really put a ton of thought into this, because if you had, you would know. I feel like there's a big attempt to make the Suarez Evra thing a rivalry, and it's one accused the other of racially abusing them. I don't know if that's a rivalry. Ditto for like John Terry and Wayne Bridge, where it's like, well, one cheated with the other's wife. I don't know if that's a rivalry necessarily. Like allegedly, I should add. So you do have a lot of those incidents where there is actual bad blood. There has been actual fighting. Craig Bellamy, didn't he swing a golf club at John Onorisa at one point and then publicly showed his remorse by doing that as a celebration after scoring? You'll get a lot of tension in locker rooms, I think, but I feel like we've covered a lot of the big ones.
Yeah, Neil Maupay versus Everton. I've mentioned this on the show before, but he has a personal agenda against Everton on social media. I just don't think he had a great time playing for Everton when he was there, and he just takes every opportunity to have a jab at them. But I don't think Neil Maupay versus Everton is anywhere close to Wenger versus Ferguson. It probably doesn't deserve to be said in the same breath.
Who are the players? This could be its own topic. Who are the players that like most publicly hate their former club? Like Angel Di Maria made no bones about not liking Manchester United and not wanting to be there. I think that was kind of before, during, and after his time in Manchester. So I'm not sure that one counts.
That quote from his wife is one of my favourite quotes. Manchester reminds me of the back of a fridge. It's so unfair as well because Manchester is actually nice, but it does have this reputation. So yeah, Angel Di Maria.
What do you now? I'm fat because I'm like dusty and unkempt. Does she mean like utilitarian and boring?
I don't know, just like rusty, I think is what she's going for, and kind of industrial. But yeah, Di Maria, Adebayor, I guess would be the other one.
That's a good one. He does kind of ratchet things up there, doesn't he?
Van Persie, going to Manchester United. That's an interesting one.
That's a lovely one. I think maybe you get moments where the individual player, that's a good shout, Graham, the individual player can ratchet up the rivalry between the two. So, like, Adebayor moving to City when he does and then celebrating that goal the way he does, that whole moment felt like kind of watershed for here comes City with all their money, and now they are poaching players from teams that have been finishing ahead of them, but that won't be the case for very long. And then I think, like, now that you mentioned that one, I think of Tevez. Carlos Tevez leaving Manchester United and things kind of getting really bad there, really frosty with him and Ferguson and with the club itself and him not feeling appreciated, them not feeling like he was following instruction and doing what needed to happen. And then he moves to Manchester City and there's the Welcome to Manchester billboards and that felt very much like a thing that intensified an existing rivalry for sure.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that felt like a real turning point for the Premier League, and we're still on that path with Man City and their dominance. So, Van Persie as well felt like just a kind of another nail in the coffin of that era of Wenger's Arsenal, where it was just confirmation that if you wanted to win trophies, you have to leave Arsenal. But I think for their sake, it seems like they're coming out of that now.
I think that's the happiest I've ever been with a Manchester United signing. I just remember being like, well, that's pretty terrific.
Makes more sense when you realise. It makes total sense when you realise Ferguson knows that's his last season, right? Mm-hmm. Where he's just like, I'm just going to go out and get the best goal scorer in the league and let someone else fix all the fundamental issues in this team.
And still waiting for that person to show up. The chosen one is what we call them, the prophesized one, who will one day return to fix the budget and make things work. Alas, it was not Erik ten Hag. We'll see if it's Ruben Amorim. He says with a very happy voice because he doesn't feel like it is.
That is the right tone.
All right. Well, Graham Ruffin, on that note, thank you, a man with whom I will never have a rivalry, or will I? We'll see. Mr. Ruffin, thank you for all of your research and thoughts today.
Thank you, Taylor Rockwell.
Listeners, thank you all so much for listening. My guess is that we will be back. I know we'll be back next week with another episode. My guess is that it will be about a league from a country that is qualified for the World Cup. So if you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to let us know what league you would like covered or what domestic league you would like covered from a team that's qualified for the World Cup. You can send us an email if you'd like to do the same if you're not watching on YouTube. But for now, thank you all for listening. Thank you all for watching. We'll talk to you again very soon.